the president of the Age Peace Foundation. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome you to today's discussion of nuclear dangers in Ukraine in the third year of this devastating war. We're fortunate to have with us leading world experts on this topic, Dr. Grigory Yavlinsky, a Russian economist and politician, Katrina vanden, Heuvel, the editorial director and publisher of The Nation, Professor Richard Falk, the Albert Milbank Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University, and our moderator, Cynthia Lazaroff, who's an expert on US-Russia relations and a documentary filmmaker. You will have the opportunity to read the biographies of our moderator and panelists in the chat as they join the conversation. I'm deeply grateful to Cynthia for bringing this event to life and for leading the discussion today. I'm also pleased to acknowledge the tremendous support of Cynthia and Richard, who are board members of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, both to me personally and to the organization as a whole. I have one general point and two logistical points that I would like to make before we get started. The general point is that we're living in exceedingly challenging times, with the Ukraine war looming as a threat to all of humanity, and yet not the only geopolitical or regional or local challenge that we face. Why have the voices calling for negotiations since 2022 been silenced so effectively? And how can we change the status quo before it is too late for us, for the human civilization, and for all of life on our planet? Today's discussion aims to explore these questions. My other comments are strictly logistical. If you would like to listen to the conversation in English, please go to the interpretation menu at the bottom of the screen and select English. If you would like to listen to the conversation in Russian only, please go to the interpretation menu at the bottom of the screen and select Russian. If you would like to listen in both English and Russian, depending on who is speaking, you do not need to do anything. You can leave your settings as they are right now. We will begin with a discussion by our panelists, and towards the end, if time permits, we will also take questions in the chat and ask the panelists to respond to them. Thank you once again for being with us today, and let me hand off to Cynthia. Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Ivana. I join you in giving a very warm welcome to our speakers and all present today, and I'm so honored and grateful to be part of this conversation. I especially want to express our gratitude to you, Dr. Yavlinsky. It's a rare privilege to be having this conversation with you at such a perilous moment as we move through the third year of war in Ukraine, with the daily ongoing killing, immense human suffering, and increased risk of escalation to a nuclear exchange in the fog of this war. Thank you so much for saying yes to this conversation and for being with us today. It's truly an honor to have you with us. So we're going to start with a question for all of our speakers, and we're going to begin with you, Dr. Yavlinsky. So I want to start, and if I may, I'll address you as Grigory. In this third year of war in Ukraine, what are you most concerned about, and how concerned are you about the risk of escalation to nuclear war, whether by accident or intention? What do you make of Russia's announcement this week of plans to hold drills with troops based near Ukraine to practice for the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons? Grigory, please.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I would be more glad if you invited me for another occasion in the context of different conditions. But unfortunately, the world today is such that this conversation is probably one of the most important ones. Okay, you ask me, what am I mostly concerned about? I am mostly concerned about with the huge number of people who lose their lives. I don't know the exact numbers. Nobody reports them, as a matter of fact. But even if we rely on publications, I would remind you what Foreign Affairs had to say on the subject quite recently, in early March of this year. They had the number to the effect that the officials, the US officials, say that as of August 2023, since February 22, Russian and Ukrainian losses amounted to almost 500,000 people. I'm not sure how correct this number is, but the fact that such a serious publication as Foreign Affairs cites this number, it's quite enough for me to say what worries me most of all. I'm worried most of all by the fact that people are dying every day, every minute. Apart from that, I'm worried by destruction that takes place. And this is the second thing that is happening. And I'm not surprised. The United Nations says that to restore Ukraine, and that's the data from last year, published this year. So the UN has the number of $446 billion. That's to restore Ukraine. I don't think this is the final or finite number. It's just this number, also considering the fact that the budget deficit in Ukraine is almost 20% of the annual GDP. $40 billion, 20% of GNP. So these economic problems worry me immensely. Looking to the future, it's very difficult for me to understand how we're going to resolve these problems. Who will resolve them? Where do we take the means, the money to resolve these problems for a huge country? And the third thing that I'd like to say is that what's taking place completely blocks the prospects. At present, surprising as it is, there are very few discussions on the problems of construction or what we can expect in the future as a prospect. Mainly the discussions are concerned the subjects of artificial intelligence and who's going to be the winner, Trump or Biden. It's important probably to discuss this, but it completely evades the main problem. So lack of perspective, loss of life, and economic problems, that's what worries me most in relation to what's going on in Ukraine right now. Then you ask me if it's possible at all that the current events can even increase a nuclear threat and lead to a nuclear war. You're asking my opinion about the fact that this week the officials in Russia spoke about drills with the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, I'm worried about that. I don't think this is absolutely senseless. I don't think it's just blackmail. What I think is that it is the reality, and in this sense, I agree with Mr. Biden, the US president. At the end of the 2022, as New York Times published in March, as it appears, even in 2022, Biden spoke about the fact that nuclear, chemical, and other weapons of mass destruction may be used. And he did say openly and publicly that this might happen. Here, I agree. There is such a threat. I can even tell you, being quite confident, that if there is a direct confrontation with NATO, this threat is not going to be just a threat. It's going to be probably a reality. And I would also like to say that I think that it's all very serious. It's not idle conversation. It's very realistic. So Putin's statement related to the subject should be taken extremely seriously and with extreme attention, as well as his other statements. You may like or dislike them, but it's beside the point. The content is important, and he's saying what can become a reality. No wonder that the US press and other media talk about it in some detail. There is a threat like this. Why did it all happen? Why are we talking about the plans to have drills using the troops that are very close to the Ukraine, and Belarus is saying something to this effect? In fact, I think that this is a response to statements that we all can hear from Macron, the French president, when he says that probably they should send troops to Ukraine. And this is a way leading to a direct confrontation with NATO. Macron speaks about it. Or all of a sudden, Cameron says, yes, Ukraine should use British missiles to launch against Russia. If the Americans think that they shouldn't use such weapons on Russian territory, Mr. Cameron puts it in a totally different context. He says, yes, if you think it's necessary. Talking to the Ukrainians, he says, yes, if you think it's necessary, you can do that. You can really attack Russia's territory. So Putin's statement was a response to that. It's also related to the fact that yesterday, during inauguration, Putin said that he's ready for negotiations. Said, yes, we're ready for talks, negotiations. We're ready. However, before saying that, he had given an order for such drills I mentioned. So all these statements have led to the occurrence of this idea to use tactical nuclear weapons. Now, last thing I want to say here. The continuation of the conflict, the development of this conflict, can really result in such consequences. it is such a conflict, such a type of a conflict, and it's developing in such a way that it's quite possible that it'll lead to such consequences. And we need to be very clear about that. It's not some kind of a fantasy. It's not something dreamed up. It's not blackmail. It is reality. So this danger really exists, unless this conflict will somehow change and it doesn't continue as it is going on now. That was my attempt at answering your questions.
Thank you, Grigory. It's really important to hear your perspective for all of us. And I appreciate especially your highlighting the catastrophic human losses that we have to keep in mind, the daily loss of life every day. And your perspective on the nuclear danger, to hear that it's not just blackmail or idle threats, that it's a reality. Thank you for sharing with us your perspective on the gravity of what's at stake in this moment for as long as this war goes on. Really, really helpful and really grateful. Katrina, would like to turn to you and to hear your thoughts on what Grigory has said, and also any additional comments you'd like to make on the question. We can't hear you, Katrina. Need to go to the English channel, I believe. Yes?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Forgive me. First of all, I just want to thank Grigory Yavlinsky for his courage over time and for understanding what has been squandered. There was an alternative, a real alternative. And thank you, Grigory, for giving an interview and publishing several of your very humane articles in The Nation, which over the years published my late husband, Stephen Cohen, and Mikhail Sergeyevich and others, Nadia Zhkikina. I think we're living in a time of escalation now as we witness French Legion troops. President Biden has said they're combat advisors. The restraints he put on weapons systems has been lifted in terms of attacks going into the Russian territory. The tactical nukes that were discussed by President Putin seem very responsive to the NATO and other statements and the arms shipments that have come from the United States. I guess what I feel is end the killing, ceasefire. We know now that there were efforts in 2022 that were aborted. There are serious discussions about that. But to end the killing, not just in Ukraine and Russia, but in so many of the conflicts we're involved with, it is a humanitarian tragedy we're witnessing. And of course, Putin did launch the war. History does not justify, but it informs, because we know the backdrop of NATO expansion and other issues, which are often discounted in our media. There's very little history. But the fact that Ukraine and Russia are now fighting World War I battles in the trenches in this horrifying war of attrition has led to the deaths you cited, Grigory, but also, the landmines, the reconstruction of a country is something we have not been very able at. If you look at Afghanistan and other countries, the militarization of our politics, not just in the United States, but there's very little in our media often about the analysis of diplomacy or dialogue. Maybe that's because there isn't enough, and diplomacy and dialogue has been criminalized or demonized. But it's literally lists of weapons or cheerleading to keep the war going on. And the backdrop or the foreground of that is this unraveling of the scaffolding of arms control. Put aside abolition, but arms control agreements over the last 15, 20 years. The ABM under George W., the Open Skies Treaty, the Global Assembly at the UN has been doing very important work, but it's very scary, and accidental nuclear attack is always the most scary to me. There's a little more attention being paid in the United States media. Annie Jacobson's book has gotten some attention. The New York Times is coming back. But so many millions believe the end of the Soviet Union meant the end of the nuclear danger, which is so dangerous. I think that the ability, there is a reconstruction conference in Berlin in early June, and there's a peace meeting in Switzerland, but President Putin has not been invited. The Pope has, and it seems that the Pope is the only person who's, maybe besides Grigory Yavlinsky, is not fearful of using the word peace, which is a dangerous word these days. But I do think the humanitarian disaster, landmines, the fact that this country and others are literally paying pensions in Ukraine, are keeping the budget of Ukraine solid, and that there are oligarchs of not only the United States, but other oligarchs in Ukraine ready to do a kind of shock therapy. But the most important thing is what Grigory Yavlinsky, and I say this humbly in the spirit of Mikhail Gorbachev, who laid out a different world order that might have been with us, but not NATO, which is, last I checked, not a coffee klatch, but a military interoperability organization. But that idea of a common European home from Vladivostok to Lisbon, which was treated with seriousness, seems obliterated as we watch French Legion troops travel to Kiev. The last thing I'd say is there are many, I think, inside both countries, and Grigory knows this better because he's had family in Ukraine, but often you don't hear from the voices which do seek an end to war for different reasons. They're not pacifists, but they seek an end to the brutality that they've experienced. So I think the effort has to be undertaken. It seems very impossible, unachievable. But I think Gorbachev once said, if we don't begin to eradicate nuclear weapons, the unthinkable will become the thinkable. And I think we have to find ways to end this war, as Grigory wrote so and speaks so eloquently of. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Your perspective, bringing the historical context in and what could have been and maybe might still be, really grateful for that. And also, again, highlighting the risk of escalation, citing those escalatory steps that have been taken that seem to be pointing us in the direction of that possibility more now than recently, and also again highlighting the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of this war. Thank you. Richard, please, we welcome you.
It's a great honor to be here with Grigory Yavlinsky and my longtime friends, Katrina and Cynthia. And their diagnosis is very chilling, but compelling. And I think that we must awaken to that reality and couple it to this uncertainty as to how dangerous the nuclear threat has become. There's a great deal of attention these days being accorded to the Middle East and Gaza in particular, and it has aroused the student population of America in a way that it hasn't been for decades, since the Vietnam War, really. But what I find most disturbing as an American is the absence from the White House or the State Department of any receptivity to a diplomatic effort to establish a ceasefire followed by negotiating a political compromise. This war is going on at the great expense of the people of Ukraine, and in my judgment, it could have been ended shortly after the Russian attack in a way that it will probably be ended whenever the political will finally emerges in Moscow and Washington to let that happen. And again, as an American, I have to say that despite many dreadful things that Putin has done, he has at least indicated an openness to negotiation. And why President Biden has stayed away from even suggesting that option is a colossal failure of leadership. And
Yeah.
it is something that is geopolitically deeply irresponsible.
Mm.
And it seems to reflect the view that what the war became about was less the future of Ukraine than the future alignment of US, Russia, and China.
Mm-hmm.
Really a war about geopolitical realignment. And that's what keeps it going at the terrible expense of the Ukrainians and secondarily of the Russians who are dying for a futile undertaking that has these built-in dangers. When one thinks about the Cold War and the role of nuclear weapons in the Cold War, there's a strange sort of reversal that seems evident here, where it is the Russian side that seems to feel that it needs to stress its capability and potential will to use tactical nuclear weapons. It used to be something that the West talked about much more than the Soviet Union talked about limited nuclear war. Henry Kissinger made its reputation by saying that a limited nuclear war could be won and under certain circumstances would be justifiable. So I think the situation is very dangerous. It has no fault lines that are mutually respected as existed during the Cold War. We have a Secretary of State who talks about the non-existence of spheres of influence, while the US, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has regarded the entire world as its sphere of influence. And so I may be stressing too much a critical view of how the US has miscalculated and mishandled the Ukrainian reality at the primary expense of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
Yeah.
Let me stop there.
Richard, thank you so much for your words, chilling but compelling, and the moment calling for us awakening to the reality, again, of the gravity of what's at stake, of the nuclear danger here, bringing in the absence and colossal failure of leadership to be open to negotiations and diplomacy at such a critical time when there's so much loss of life. And again, and bringing in the geopolitical dimension of this war, which I'm sure we'll get into more later in the conversation, which is so important. Thank you. Grigory, I want to turn to you for the next question, but if you have some comments you'd like to make right now on what's been said, you're welcome to do that, or we can go to the next question.
Well, yes, I would like to make a few comments. Once again, I would like to thank Katrina for her kind words and for putting me in the same in the same sort of breath, mentioning me with the Pope. It's not the worst kind of company, but that's a separate issue, because he was the first one to whom I appealed for ceasefire. And the main topic that was discussed, whether he would be able to talk to the leadership of the United States. He had a lot of doubts with regard to this possibility. He didn't think that the United States leadership was ready to talk to him, because for the first time, he was representing Latin America as the Pope. These are interesting circumstances, and taking this opportunity, I would like to pay my respects and my tremendous gratitude to your husband, who has done a lot for Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev had a lot of respect for him, and I remember the results of his work and your words to the effect that the European home, it's a prospect to have this home from Lisbon to Vladivostok. In actual fact, that is the only prospect of peace. Of course, we may be talking at the perspective of 2050, 2050, and it can materialize only on one condition, that there will be no nuclear war.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, it is the only construction, so to speak, whereby the war between France and Germany ended. And today nobody cares who Strasbourg belongs to. How about Lorraine and Alsace? Nobody even stops to think about it. That's the construction that was suggested by the European Union many years ago. This was about 70 years ago. So this is a very serious option that you brought up, Katrina. And you also mentioned ceasefire. And here I would like to thank Richard as well for his very honest and very sincere, the way I see it, very honest and open comments. Who can explain to me why, on a daily basis, every day, they talk about ceasefire in the Middle East?
Yeah.
Between Israel and Gaza and Palestine, in the Middle East conflict, Israel and the Gaza situation, everybody talks about ceasefire, and no one talks about a possible ceasefire with regard to the conflict in Ukraine. Why is it so? Probably because, as Richard said, it is the geopolitical problems and issues come to the forefront. The geopolitical issues, because it is profitable to achieve ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas conflict, if it can be named a conflict. And it is not profitable from the geopolitical standpoint to talk about ceasefire in Ukraine and to say that, say, in 2025, the war will be over. But how about people dying? Does it matter at all? Is it not a restriction? Is it not a fact? Does it not matter at all? to me, this is a very serious issue and a very painful and open issue. And I would like to remind everyone, and we'll come back to that when we talk about justice. So if somebody wants to achieve justice through the deaths of a huge number of people and the absence of peace, there will be no peace. There will be no justice and there will be no peace. If you choose before justice and peace, I don't think you can have either of that. But that's sort of an apropos comment. Thank you very much, Katrina and Richard, for your wonderful comments and very interesting. So I've responded to that because this is very much to the point.
Thank you, Grigory, for again shedding more light on what Katrina and Richard have said and reminding us about the people dying and the absence of calls for a ceasefire, about the war in Ukraine, the conspicuous absence compared to Israel-Palestine at this point. So thank you for that. And I'd like to move to the next question, starting with you, Grigory. And this is really, this next set of questions is really centered around your call for a ceasefire. And in a Nation magazine interview earlier this year, which I just want to acknowledge both Katrina for publishing that interview and my friend Nadia Ajgikina for that interview with you, Grigory, and you said so many powerful things in that interview. Thank you. You said, among many other things, quote, "Russia and Ukraine are very dear to me. They are like my right and left hands. What is happening is incredibly painful for me, and I will do everything to stop the deaths of both Russians and Ukrainians. Ceasefire first and foremost." When I read your words, I was very moved and learned that you were born in Ukraine and lived there until you moved to Russia at age 17. You have a brother still living in Ukraine and a lifetime of friends and loved ones in both countries. Why are you calling for an immediate ceasefire as an imperative first step towards peace in Ukraine and future negotiations?
Yes, of course. People both in Ukraine and in Russia are dear to me. Those who live in Ukraine and in Russia, many people who consider themselves Russians live in Ukraine, but it really is not the point. The point is that these are all people, alive human beings who have kids, who have parents. And it's not a matter of nationality or who lives where. The thing is that it's impossible to reach any results by doing what's being done. When so many people die, no results can be achieved. So it's necessary to apply every effort to recover. Of course, Russia is very dear to me, and Ukraine is very dear to me, but other countries as well are dear to me. This is a question of principle for me. In modern world, in the 21st century, when there's so much talk about multipolarity, yes, there's a lot of discussion about the fragmentation of the world, that there will be several or many centers of geopolitical influence, geopolitical force, that there will be different poles, so to speak, multipolarity. What does it mean? It means that on one pole you can kill people, and on the other pole you cannot. Is that what multipolarity has in store for us? How should we understand this concept? I think that multipolarity can exist as different methods of attaining one goal. And this goal is the human development, human freedom, human rights, future of people, kids. This is what should be the mainstay of our life. This is what modern multipolarity should be about. And here I would support Richard. Nobody is discussing this in this way. They talk about it in a different way. On this pole, anything goes. On the other pole, we can do the same, but in a different manner. If we carry on like this, we'll be facing a major catastrophe. This is what I want to say. Anyway, my opinion about the ceasefire has a lot to do with the fact that both Ukraine and Russia, my homelands and my father, defended them both during World War II against fascist Germany. This is all true. But I'm talking here about humanity as a whole, because nuclear threat is a threat to everybody. It's not a threat against one nation or another. This is a threat of world scale. This is what Gorbachev and Reagan tried to resolve. This is a totally different level, and that's why I'm talking about it. You probably will ask me about more details, then I will go into more details.
Grigory, I echo Katrina in wanting to honor you and thank you for your courage and your moral leadership and centering the human story in this war and centering people and also centering our children and our future. Deeply grateful to you. So the next part of this question for you, Grigory, is to talk a little bit in more detail about how you see a ceasefire agreement, what it would look like. And first, in your view, which parties besides Ukraine and Russia would need to be involved in negotiating, implementing, and maintaining a ceasefire agreement? What do you see as the role of the UN? And finally, research shows that when women in civil society participate in peace processes, an agreement is more likely to be reached and to last. What do you think the chances are of establishing an inclusive peace process for a sustainable peace in Ukraine, starting with the negotiations for a ceasefire?
First of all, I'd like to clarify one thing. Why am I talking about a ceasefire first and foremost? Because as of today, there are nothing to achieve a peace agreement, at least nothing substantive. So the first step, and the most important step at this time, to stop killing people on both sides. This has to do with the separation of troops, separation of heavy weaponry, demining of certain areas. This includes also exchange of bodies, corpses. I'm sorry, I'm speaking so bluntly. This includes exchange of prisoners. Also, the return of kids to both sides. This concerns a lot of people. This is what I mean saying ceasefire. It is not to be confused with some political agreements. We cannot see them on the horizon. We can't see who will do this, how they would speak to each other, but this is something that can be done with the participation of foreign observers. We need to resolve the issue about the civilian population that found themselves on the other side of the front lines. I'd like to give you an example. Ceasefire. It's the only agreement that exists in Korea between the two Koreas. It was signed with a great difficulty 70 years ago. And there's no war. There's been no war for 70 years. There's been no peace agreement, but there's been no war either for 70 years. This is what a ceasefire can achieve. There is a ceasefire agreement between Russia and Japan after World War II. Also, there's been no war. They have issues concerning the islands, but there is no war. At some point, this particular method was used when the Soviet Union in 1939 waged war against Finland, and Marshal MoneyGram convinced the Finnish leadership to stop, irrespective of the fact that some territories were won over by Russia. And he was able to convince the Finnish leadership that to save Finland, we need a ceasefire. I can give you more examples. There are examples in the world, but nobody quotes them. I don't know why. Putin, too, many times mentioned that he is ready for such talks. So I know that there are doubts and questions. As for the questions that I'm familiar with, we'll return to these questions today. But at this point, the situation looks to me like this, and that is why I insist on the fact that a ceasefire is an important and big event. When this happens, then other elements will probably appear. The elements of future negotiations. Now, one more thing. I believe that without the United States, that invests huge amounts of money in this campaign, there'll be no negotiations. Negotiations between Moscow and Kiev don't mean anything for many, many, many reasons. And they will give us nothing, again, for many reasons. So in this area, in this narrow area, the negotiations on a ceasefire, this is the responsibility of those who supports Ukraine in this conflict. It's a serious business. And who is it? It's the United States. Ideally, the US would somehow think of going to Beijing and agree with China, for China too to take part in the negotiations. Then we would be looking at a 100% result. But nothing is being done. Nothing is undertaking such diplomacy and diplomatic work. None. That's it. They just say that let Kiev itself to resolve everything. But Kiev cannot resolve it. So when you ask me this question, which other party should be engaged? I'm saying which party it should be. I'm not certain, but I think that Russian President Putin means exactly the same when he mentions talks. He means exactly this very thing. So this is an answer to the question, what would be with Ukraine, with the NATO expansion, etc. Putin means such kind of talks. Historically speaking, we can say that the United States faces a very complicated election, and that's putting it mildly. And there is this situation when the US doesn't think about much else, and the war will go on. And then we understand that this might really evolve into a major conflict. This is what this special situation is about, which we're all living through. It is a geopolitical and political thing, pure and simple. It's not a question of being just or unjust. It's a different order of things. We should talk about our children, our future, the future of people, and all geopolitical issues could be postponed to be resolved later, during some other second phase when this very issue has been resolved, but nobody wants to tackle it, if I understood it correctly. As for the United Nations and its role, you also mentioned this, I view the United Nations with great respect. We should listen to Guterres, and he's saying that we cannot influence anything. It's a crisis situation, you know? It's really a crisis situation. Recently, I published an article called The New World Disorder. And Grigory clarifies it's not order, it's disorder. And one of the conclusions is that the United Nations isn't functioning anymore. It's paralyzed practically. The Security Council is not functioning. It can hold a vote, but it's all recommendations. And these things are serious. As for your question concerning participation of women, I don't understand quite your questions. People must take care of it. Why separate women? Maybe there is, there is a psychological analysis which says that women are more kind than men. But you know what? I'm not really hot on discussing these topics. All that want peace, all that want the killings to stop, all who want to save our children and our future, all these people will be very important. As for civil society and its participation, it's an important question, of course. One of the problems, and Katrina knows it very well, so one of the problems is why this happened in Russia is exactly the fact that the reforms that took place in Russia, they did not allow to create a civil society. That's it. Russia did not create a civil society. There is no civil society in Russia. It's a separate issue. It's a major issue. So that's why I'm saying that civil society and its participation and participation of women is very important. That's granted. These are all very important issues. I cannot even say anything special. You know it yourself quite well. I want to thank profoundly those who understand it and those who would like to take part in this process. Yes, civil initiative are very important. They're trying to set up such structures in Russia, but to no avail so far. If I fail to answer every question, I may add something. Maybe I missed part of the question.
Grigory, thank you. That was very comprehensive. I think you addressed all those questions, and very much appreciate your clarifying what you see as the important components of a ceasefire. That was very helpful. And also who the players need to be. Let's just say that your vision of the US, China, Russia, Ukraine as being absolutely imperative participants in this ceasefire and moving forward to an eventual peace agreement in Ukraine. And then also just you're echoing the importance of involving everybody, having an inclusive peace process that involves women are traditionally excluded from peace processes. So involving civil society and women and everyone who wants peace actors being part of the peace process, people who want peace. Thank you for that. Very, very helpful. Now I want to go to the next follow-up question on the ceasefire, again for you, Grigory. Many in Ukraine and the West say that Vladimir Putin has no incentive to enter into a ceasefire agreement because Russia is now in a stronger position on the battlefield. Yet over the past year, and you've mentioned this in our Zoom already, Putin has sent signals both publicly and through intermediaries that he is ready to consider a ceasefire. You met with Putin in October 2023 to discuss a ceasefire. What did he say, and what do you think the prospects are for a ceasefire today?
Let's start with that meeting. Yes, I did have a meeting, and I devoted that meeting to explaining in detail. The meeting went on for an hour and a half, so I presented a detailed position on ceasefire, and the most important thing for which I requested a meeting with President Putin is that I offered myself as a negotiator and participant. So that was the point of the meeting. I can tell you that Vladimir Putin listened to me very attentively. He discussed it with me, but he did not give me a response. That's what I can tell you about that meeting. However, in November and then in December and in January and even now, again, on many occasions, he offered negotiations. In the interview to Tucker Carlson, you sent him, didn't you? You sent him to Moscow. So Carlson arrived, and there was this interview. So in talking to Tucker, if you analyze this whole interview, it was all aimed at this, putting forward a proposal of negotiations. That's how it was done. But I have to tell you an important thing. Every time when he proposed negotiations, there were more forceful blows from Ukraine on Belgorod. You see what happened? Every time when he mentioned the word, when he said, we're prepared, or let's do this, somehow the circumstances got aggravated, and there were more and more blows against Belgorod. So in a sense, this was the response. No, never, not about anything, never again. No negotiations. But you have to bear this in mind. Even if you look at the dates when he says the word negotiations, and then the next day there's a strike against Belgorod, and so on and so on and so forth. Every time this happens. So there was a position of principle expressed. He didn't use the word ceasefire, but I did say I'm prepared to start negotiations, and that's the kind of response he got. The U.S. administration categorically denied the possibility of negotiations in 22 and 23 and later on. By the way, if ceasefire had been achieved in 2022, for example, in the fall of 22, it would have been a colossal achievement, colossal. But what happened was, it was just the other way around. The opposite happened. There was giant escalation. Remember Zelensky's speech in Congress? Just the reverse happened. It was all fanned up. It was all heated up. It was not stopped in any way. Again, in Gaza, they keep saying, "Oh, the terrorists and killed 300 people," and every day they mentioned the word ceasefire, but not with regard to the Ukraine situation. So that's the kind of conversation I had with him, with Putin, and that's all I can tell you. There was no reply, but my mission was, and my role was, to offer myself as a civil society representative to take part in the negotiations. I was prepared to do that, totally prepared. And I still hope that I speak the Ukrainian language quite fluently. In addition to that, we discussed problems of economy, globalization, fragmentation, the new type of global economy, and so on and so forth. That's what I can tell you about the meeting with President Putin. Possibly an indirect consequence of that meeting was probably repetitious statements. I'm prepared to negotiations. I'm open to negotiations. But you say that he is not interested. Esteemed ladies and gentlemen, it is politics we're dealing with. It just doesn't happen the way where somebody's really genuinely interested in something. You have to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
You have to put the negotiators in such circumstances that they would not be able to exit from this kind of context. That's the diplomatic work.
Yep.
And when the ideologists write that, oh, the experience is such that he doesn't agree, he will not accept our terms, he just it's all blah blah blah, he just talks about it. But what is diplomacy about? You have to be able to negotiate and to discuss things in such a way so that your counterpart could not change the circumstances, could not deceive you. That's a lot of work. Or am I missing something about diplomacy? That is why the negotiations in Korea, there were over 500 meetings. And do you think everyone was honest with one another? Do you think there was no intent of deceit? You have to be serious about it. You can't even analyze it. It's not just sit down and have a cup of coffee or tea. It's hard work. So those who are involved in the process, they have to create the conditions and terms that would not be able to, get violated. It takes talent, it takes work, it takes effort, and some people may not like Kissinger, but he and Brzezinski worked pretty much in such a way. That's their job. By the way, let us recall, and it's really interesting. Let's think back to Khrushchev-Kennedy negotiations. That was about the Caribbean missile crisis. So if somebody said, no negotiations, one doesn't want it, and Khrushchev is deceitful, what would it have ended in? What would happen? So that's the way I see it. It's serious business. This is not really a factor. I mean, if people say he has no incentive to achieve ceasefire because Russia has a different position on battlefield and advantageous position on battlefield, it's not a factor. It still needs to be done. We still need to seek and look for the opportunity. The negotiations may be successful or unsuccessful, but that is the essence of the work at hand. And this refers to any position that I've stated so far. What kind of negotiations do we need? Ceasefire negotiations. No other type of negotiations would be realistic or possible. Impossible. Not about the territories, not about anything else. The first thing that needs to be done is stop the active conflict, because that conflict has a tendency to grow and evolve and to reach the nuclear threat. Well, the nuclear threat is here already, but it can go further. That's what I can tell you.
Again, thank you, Grigory, for highlighting the importance of resurrecting, starting diplomacy. That has to be the priority at this time for humanitarian reasons, and also because of the risk of unthinkable nuclear war. And your framing of diplomacy as the essence of the work at hand, I think, is really useful. And I know that that others share this, that you, with your background in both countries, I think would be ideally suited to be at the peace table. So I really hope that comes to pass, because I think that you can really help bring healing. And so my prayer is that happens. I think would be so important. So the last in this section on the ceasefire, and you've addressed it somewhat to begin with, but I want to just go back to it. They say, many in Ukraine and the West also say, who are critical of a ceasefire, that you can't trust Russia to honor any agreement, that a ceasefire will just give Russia a chance to rebuild its forces, to resume the fighting in Ukraine, and that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, it will move into other European countries. Many also say that it is unwise to postpone the resolution of the territorial questions, that Ukraine needs to keep fighting to win back all its territories, including Crimea, to be in a stronger position before a ceasefire talks begin. What do you think about all this?
Well, I will answer with regard to 2 points. First of all, it is very naive and sort of badly educated impression. Allegedly, in order to grow, to become stronger and grow, build up the potential, Russia needs a break. This is not so. Russia is such a huge country with such tremendous resources and such huge population. She doesn't need a break. In Siberia, Russia can form whatever it takes. It can assemble another redundant or parallel structure in order to engage in combat operations. This is an obvious issue for Russia, and it's very naive and not serious kind of consideration. Do you want an illustration? Here you go. Remember how many conversations there were about sanctions and economic sanctions against Russia, and Russia will suffer from famine and will stop in its tracks. Nothing of the kind happened. It turned out that those who thought of those, invented those sanctions, they don't know. They have no idea what kind of sanctions would work. Russia is part of the world economy, and global economy without Russia cannot exist. No matter what kind of sanctions are, used against Russia, still without Russian oil, without non-ferrous metals, without uranium, and partly without Russian gas, nothing happens, nothing works, and that's it. And then there's the third world, through which it all goes to Russia and back. Petroleum goes to India, and then from India it goes to Europe. And Europe still gets deliveries, well, a lot of stuff. I think even diamonds. Europe needed diamonds somehow urgently, and Russia received money for the diamonds. So that's as much as I can say about this naive idea that Russia needs a break. No, Russia doesn't need a break. It can form its own and reshape its resources and capability and military-industrial complex in terms of midterm, and in terms of midterm or long term, that's a different issue. Then there will be other problems with economy, but as to the current moment, Russia doesn't need a break. That's not the point. So how should I put it? This is not a serious factor. Now, talking about territories, I have to say that nothing good will come out of it, of this kind of discussions. To go back to the 1991 territories, it's not going to happen. Neither party has the strength. It will not be implemented. It will only result in more deaths of people, but there is no option. There is no way of implementing such ambitions. I won't even talk about historic facts and peculiarities in the relations. Well, the signing of Belaversky Accords, when it was signed with Kravchuk, that's a big deal. That's when Gorbachev left. That's after the signing of those agreements. They signed on December 8, 1991, and then that was the end of Gorbachev. It did not happen by chance, but that's a different story for a very big discussion. So I've answered to the best of my ability to your two questions that you put forward. So Russia doesn't need a break at the moment. Do not argue in favor of things that make no sense. And secondly, territorial ambitions, and maybe you can move back and forth so much, a little bit, but at what price? The deaths of people, and that would be the price tag of those territorial acquisitions. So to put forward the objective of achieving certain territorial positions, that means to try and make the war endless. I'm not saying who is right and who is wrong. I'm talking about the essence of the matter. To me, the essence of the matter is people's lives and the future. And that's that. So I've handled two of your questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Grigory. Again, it was really, really helpful to hear your perspective and clarifying how you see these concerns that we hear so much about in the West. So I would like to turn to you, Katrina, now to comment and respond to Grigory's comments on the ceasefire. And I just want to specifically ask, what do you think about the proposal for a ceasefire as an imperative first step? What do you think of the prospects for a ceasefire today? And what do you think are the greatest obstacles? And Katrina, I just learned that you need to leave us early.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I was going to pick up on, at the risk of having not taken Professor Falk's courses at university, the risk of bringing up the international law, which he will build on. But your book, The New World Disorder, or your article, Grigory, sounds fascinating. It is a moment of tectonic change, that goes without saying, but the geopolitical shifts. There's also this feeling of a new, not to quote an Italian communist, Gramsci, but I will, the old order disappearing, the new one not yet born. And there's a feeling that everything is either in a mode of change, disruption, of progress, process. And I think of that because of the international rule of law, which is being used in the hypocrisy of bringing it, the jurisdiction, Putin to the ICC immediately and stepping back on Israel, reveals President Biden, I think in many ways was wrong to kind of create this Manichaean world, which has many other components. It's not just democratic authoritarian. The UN, obviously a flawed but indispensable organization. I was trying to find a little card I carry around that says 10 things the UN does on any given day. The agencies are vital. And the destruction of the UN seems that what's going on with UNRWA, the kind of destruction. Richard knows that far better. I was going to say what I think just my field is media. I'm not an expert on nuclear issues, but the triumphalism, which I think so ended the ability to have dialogue in the 90s, late 80s. The Cold War wasn't won. It was negotiated in so many ways, but the triumphalism of America is afflicting its media. There's a triumphalism in coverage of Russia, of the war. There's a provincialism. There's cheerleading. There's group thinking. When all think alike, no one's thinking. There's a little bit of self-censorship, which veteran journalist Jonathan Steele writes about carefully. There's US of amnesia, the sense that the history isn't informing what we're reading. It's so much about today. So, and then the kind of, just the hypocrisy is very deep. Then, of course, Russiagate can't be ignored. If you followed Russiagate, I'm sure, Grigory, but the idea that Putin put Trump in power just alienated people like Masha Gessen, no fan of Putin, nor am I, but the idea that American journalists, had the power, or that the Russians had the power, was, I think, distorting our politics to this day. And the weird linkage, the kind of vertigo-inducing linkage between, like, Putin is Trump and Trump is Putin, ignores the isms and the disruptions of our time that contribute to the people like this. So I think those are real obstacles. I also think that and I'll stop, there is a strain in US history, US relations with Russia, interested in weakening Russia. And I think there's great unhappiness. You can see it with Anthony Blinken, China. China is supposed to be the big prize, but we're pushing Russia and China together in many ways. But I do think there's a failure to understand the global South, not a term, I guess, not a better term I can use, but that there's a voice now. There is a growing voice, and it's not just US and Russia. And I think that is kind of, for want of a better word, freaking people out. They don't know, it's a different world. And I go back and I'll just say history is so vital. Grigory, of course, knows that he ran against Putin in an election which very fine Western investigative reporters in 1996 did not believe Putin won. I mean, Yeltsin won. But the arrival of Putin was welcomed by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal in 2000. His first act in power was to give Yeltsin and his family immunity. And the looting of Russia in the 90s is comparable to what we see with the concentration of wealth, or larger. I will stop, but I think these are all obstacles. And I do think Putin in 2007, when he came to Munich, he really disturbed people because he was essentially saying, whose rules make up this globe? Your rules? There are many rules. There should be international rule of law, but the rules question continues to afflict in America, which is, I don't want to say in decline, but losing its power in many ways. And it's hard to live through that for me. So thank you.
Thank you, Katrina, again for bringing that historical lens and your media lens, and also raising the issue of the double standard that we've heard about today, and the hypocrisy in the way things are viewed from our side and from the West. Richard, I'd like to turn to you and receive your comments on Dr. Yavlinsky's call for an immediate ceasefire as an imperative first step, and what you see the obstacles are and what you think the prospects are.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I just want to say at the outset that I am very appreciative of Grigory's humanistic vision, that this is, to hear it, for Americans particularly, to hear that from a distinguished Russian voice, is a very important thing. And it's important as a way of transcending the ugly side of what has been generated by this prolonged Ukraine war. On the ceasefire itself, I think it was very interesting for Grigory to bring up the Korean example, which is a kind of demonstration that you can have a frozen peace. You know, we see frozen conflicts and frozen wars, but we forget about the possibility, and it may be the best of a series of unsatisfactory options to have a frozen peace. And I think that's really benefited the people of Korea. It has stopped terrible killing that was part of the Korean War in the early 1950s. And we should keep that in mind as a way of saying, if we get a ceasefire, we've gotten something very vital and constructive. If we get more than a ceasefire, which is some kind of political compromise, then we have something beyond that. And it becomes from a frozen peace to a real peace and the foundation of some kind of new era of coexistence. But I would stress the fact that although Putin has neutralized to some extent the value of his receptivity to negotiations by engaging in coupling them with escalations of war, he has had no response. Washington has absolutely been silent about the role of a diplomatic alternative to what is increasingly viewed by independent commentators as a futile war. I mean, not only is it a horrible experience for Ukraine, but it's something that will not result, as far as one can tell, in some improved circumstance for Ukraine. The best they can hope for is some kind of resolution of the underlying tensions and a recognition that both of these external actors miscalculated and brought great grief to the region and danger to the world. And again, the nuclear issue is important. But part of the lead up to a constructive diplomacy would be to reinforce those impulses in Putin that keep talking about negotiation, and to understand that the offsetting of them with military action is a fallback position that any leader would take to show that he's not weak, that he's not mentioning negotiations because he's about to give up or he's on the verge of surrender. This is unfortunate side effect of being completely unresponsive in Washington. And why is that unresponsiveness present? And the enormous devotion of resources when they could be used elsewhere much more constructively. The recent huge aid escalation. It has to also be seen as part of the domestic militarist Congress that is vulnerable to being persuaded of exaggerated security threats in order to appease domestic private sector interests in sustaining a militarist foreign policy. I just want to say finally one word about multipolarity. And I think the rest of a lot of the world, including many of the leaders in the global south, see multipolarity as a return to some kind of balance that comes from having competing perspectives relevant to the management of security on a global level, and that the alternative to multipolarity is a kind of hegemonic world order in which the US fills the vacuum that was created with the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War, and partly is using Ukraine to extend that post-Cold War reality where it alone could maintain the managerial role over global security. And that also suggests why the UN really was designed not to manage global power and security. Otherwise, the veto made no sense. The veto only made sense if you want the most dangerous countries in the world to be free of international law and free of the UN Charter. And as a Mexican delegate at the founding conference said, we've created an organization that holds the mice accountable while the tigers roam free. See, and that was designed. That was not an accident. It was not a failure of the UN. It was what the UN was intended to be. The primacy of geopolitics within its peace and security domain. And I applaud the role the UN has found for itself in with these specialized agencies, including the heroic work of UNRWA in Gaza during this recent period. But as a decision-making and as a implementation of international law, even the judgments of the International Court of Justice, it has no clear authority if one of these 5 permanent members of the Security Council has strategic interest in opposing it. So what one has at the UN is an implementation crisis. The UN can declare lots of things, but it can't implement them. And that was the intention of the powerful. Just as at Nuremberg with the war crimes trials, the intention was to hold the losers accountable and to exempt the winners from any kind of accountability, even for the dropping of atomic bombs. So you have this kind of bias toward geopolitical power that is built into the world order that Grigory properly calls the coming of a world disorder. Let me stop at that low point.
Thank you, Richard, for your wisdom, particularly on the flawed structure of the UN and the struggles there for it to be able to implement anything that's going to be meaningful to help us go forward because of the structure of the Security Council and the power there, the veto power, and the absence of political will for negotiations in the US and the reasons why, and again, bringing in that geopolitical perspective. We're looking at time. I'd like to go to one more question that I'd like to each of you to answer, if you could, rather in a short way so we can have some time for questions for the audience, but which is related to it's really connected to diplomacy, and it's the issue of dialogue. You know, even at the worst moments of the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union maintained a dialogue, and there was an insulated, safe space for arms control. Today, dialogue between the US and Russia, the two countries which together possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, has come to a halt. Since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, talks on nuclear risk reduction, arms control, and strategic stability have been suspended. Cooperation on climate change and terrorism has also been fractured by the war. So the question is, do you think there's any chance of restoring a dialogue or cooperation in any of these areas before the war ends? If so, where do you think the windows for engagement might be, or even for opening the windows just a tiny crack in this direction? And if not, what do you think the costs are of not cooperating on these existential threats? And maybe just your sort of summary thoughts on this question so that we do have time to move to the audience and hear from the audience some questions that they have. And I'd like to, again, to start with you, Grigory, if you might start, I'd be grateful.
what can I say? In reality, Katrina and Richard described a picture that is very clear. There are decisions to be made, but there are no politicians who can make them. And that's a very dangerous and dramatic situation. Diplomacy was replaced by emotions, arrogance. And that's not a timely way to behave these days. This is the most serious obstacle. Diplomacy was replaced by emotions, juvenile emotions, and huge arrogance, which can hardly be explained as to where it's coming from and what it's based on. So when they say that the position on a ceasefire is humane or humanistic, no, it's not. It's just pragmatic. The second thing that can be said is it is humanistic, of course. But the first thing is that it is a pragmatic approach. And we need a pragmatic approach to achieve this. A ceasefire is not weakness, it is force. The ability to talk under these horrible circumstances. And this is what we badly lack in trying to resolve this situation. That's why we're here. We came where we are at this point. Imagine if Washington worked for a ceasefire, we would be facing quite a different situation. And Washington would be in a different situation. Now is the time, as Richard underlined correctly, that we must learn in a multipolar world, in the conditions of the world that is taking shape now. Otherwise, this so-called world disorder would result in grave consequences. We need to think now how to organize our world. We should not cling to the past. In the face of a large-scale conflict or even conflicts, that would be wrong. So, speaking about this, and also to give an opportunity to our audience to ask questions, I'd like to say there are decisions, there are no people who can make them. There is no wish, there is no dynamics. World press is not writing about what's relevant. Well, it's a risky statement on my part, but this is life. What can I do? I will be ready to answer any questions.
Thank you, Grigory. Katrina, Richard, would you like to have just a short response, closing words, and we'll move to the audience then? Is there anything you'd like to say?
Very, very short. I see that Pavel Devyatkin is on the call. He was on the call, but I do think dialogue could begin with science. It's in the decades past, there was pugwash, but he's doing work in the Arctic, which is very powerful and maintains ties with Russian and I believe Ukrainian scientists. I think the Rotarians, there's someone on from the Rotarians, you know, they have networks all over the world. I do think women, I'm not sure in the way you phrased it, Cynthia, but I think of the strontium in this country in the 60s created women's groups committed to nuclear abolition, nuclear ending the nuclear peril. I've revived a committee, my husband Steve kind of revived, but the American Committee on U.S.-Russia Accord, and we have Matlock and Bill Bradley, who admires Grigory enormously. But people, and you, Cynthia, but people who commit to dialogue. And I think the media, I mean, The Nation has partnered with Novaya Gazeta over the years to do different projects in publishing Grigory, a voice of humanity. but just to provide the alternatives that are often excluded from the mainstream press as to why peace is not a subversive word. And lastly, always the belief, you think I sat next to someone the other evening who'd worked on the Irish time of troubles with George Mitchell, and there was, that was not easy. So it's patience, it's dialogue, and just to restore the idea, diplomacy may not be the right word because it's maybe old-fashioned, but it's real. And I think the Quincy Institute, which is committed to diplomacy and restraint, is a good entrance, a good entry in this Washington world where you do need countervailing force. So thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Please.
If possible, I would like to intervene very briefly with regard to what Katrina has just said. Sabaka. In 2001, Putin suggested to NATO, and General Secretary of NATO Roberts came to see Putin, and Putin put forward a project of joining the armed forces of NATO and the strategic potential of Russia. That was his proposal. That's what Putin proposed to Robertson. That was February 2001. There was no answer, no reply to that, none. If world media as a whole jointly and severally wrote about that, the results would have been very different, totally different. And I can give you several examples of this kind. It was a serious matter. Yeah. It was a real thing. The general headquarters of the army, the foreign ministry of Russia, it was my initiative, and we all worked on that together. I'd worked on that since 1994, and that was officially proposed. And there are records of that and articles in the Russian press. But there was no response. That's kind of echoes what Richard was saying and what Katrina has just told us about. Those are the realities, and that's where we are now.
Thank you, Grigory. Richard, please, just if you have some closing words of wisdom.
Well, I don't know about wisdom, but I think it's not only dialogue, but there's an absence of vision, an absence of imagination, and that traps us in the familiar channels and makes leaders susceptible to special interests and pressures, short-term pressures that are, I don't know, we need dialogue that enlarges the domain of the possible.
Right.
And fills it with a realism with hope, essentially. And I think all three of us, four of us, want that as a future for humanity.
Thank you, Richard. That's so beautiful, and to all three of you for your sharing your insights and wisdom and recommendations as we move forward into the Q&A. It's been really illuminated and brings, I think, all of us some hope for a ceasefire and moving forward to peace in Ukraine. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ivana, and those in the audience who have questions. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you all so very much for these insightful and yet sobering remarks. I have a few questions from the audience, but I wanted to just open up. I can't resist the opportunity to ask Dr. Yavlinsky. You spoke about the lack of existence of civil society and civil society initiatives in Russia. What can those of us in the West, in the United States, where, you know, sometimes we like to say we have a civil society, but at times it feels like we can't make enough progress. What can we do? How can we help? What would you recommend to those of us who consider ourselves peace activists? Any ideas would be very welcome.
First, let me tell you, put your house in order.
Mm.
That, you know, give us example if you can. That's said in English. That's the most important thing. Just show us how. What you can do. Try to resolve your issues. Find two modern, adequate presidential candidates, and then we'll follow your example. That's the least you can do. Show us how universities work. That's about it. And ask and move to the center of your attention, the most important issue, question. It is impossible to allow people to be killed in any part of the world. That would be very helpful to us. Not anywhere, nowhere. There is no price for human lives because they have children, because they have brothers, and they are our future. Not in Afghanistan, not in Iraq, not in Vietnam, not in Korea, in no country, in no place on the world, on the globe. That's it. That's all. And all the other issues, we have to address them ourselves. We have to learn to build our country and to resolve our issues. And in order to start doing that, we need a ceasefire. That's a sine qua non. And then we'll do the rest. I don't know what else I can say. Thank you so much for your question.
That's perfect. No, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Let me ask a couple of questions from the audience. Alex Elliott asked.
Yes, I'm ready to answer.
Great. So Alex Elliott asked, is saying that we are in a new Cold War a de-escalating move right now or not? Or are we? Are we in the new Cold War? And is acknowledging that helpful or not helpful? Maybe we can start with Dr. Yavlinsky and also hear from Richard and Katrina.
I don't know exactly how to answer. It looks different because now there are such phenomena as artificial intelligence. Now we have this crazy internet, the networks, social media. We have such tools where it's really hard to understand how that would work. So far, we haven't come up with a new coinage, but the Cold War is the notion that appeals to me, because it ended up disappearing in the end. That's the good part about it, that its main merit, and it remained cold. But seriously speaking, the conflict is escalating. It's growing fast, and it's getting more and more dangerous than any scenarios that we had during the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War resulted in the nuclear arms control. There was a whole number of agreements and treaties and restrictions put on the arms, on nuclear weapons. The process of disarmament was launched. And what's happening now has resulted in canceling all of those agreements and treaties. There are none. Almost everything has been destroyed. Everything positive that existed during the Cold War has been canceled. All sorts of accords and agreements. And do have a look. Who was the first to start canceling those agreements and leaving the accords? Let's
John Bolton.
get out of this agreement. Let's cancel this one. And I can enumerate them. I knew this question would come up, but I won't, use the time to do that. Have a look. Just look up the negotiations. It started with George W. Bush, and then Biden also, and then Trump had a go at that, and Biden also, was part of concluding an agreement, but it doesn't work anymore. It's not the Cold War. It's something different, and we have to understand that it's a very dangerous phenomenon.
Thank you so much. Katrina and Richard, if either of you wanted to address this question.
I think it's a more dangerous time. I don't know what we call it, a new Cold War, but I think the threat of proliferation of nukes is very dangerous without the scaffolding, in a good sense, of an arms control set of agreements, which I think in Washington, there's a view that they're technical, but they need political foundation, which we don't have. And I think you have rise of private armies, rise of technology, you have a similarity where Russia and China and the United States are in different countries, often for more extractive purposes than battling the Soviet Union. I do just want to call out the legacy of the Cold War is tragic in Cuba, where there is a humanitarian crisis compounded by the COVID period, and of course the structural reforms are so tough. But it's hard to believe that we're still embargoing in a way. But I do think it's more dangerous.
Richard?
Well, I agree with what's been said, and I would only add that we shouldn't romanticize arms control during the Cold War. It included a kind of Faustian bargain in which the nuclear weapon states kept their oligopoly over the weaponry and tried to control other states from acquiring the weapons. So it was part of a hegemonic order that was being celebrated for stability, not for getting rid of the weaponry. And I think it's important to take a clearer view that the only decent response to nuclearism is real good faith commitment to disarmament and to the abolition of the weaponry, which is what the treaty prescribed. Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty commits the nuclear weapon states to enter in good faith nuclear disarmament talks. And it's viewed cynically by the American foreign policy elite, that this was just to get the agreement. It was never taken seriously as a part of the mutual commitment. And I think we need to understand that part of the frustration of the non-nuclear countries that is coming out with this new treaty of prohibition of nuclear weapons is a consequence of this failure to follow through on what was proclaimed to them to be a mutual bargain, not a one-sided commitment.
Thank you all so much. Since we're at the 2-hour mark, I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we will close. Katrina, after you had your introductory remarks, Angela Bischoff wrote in the chat that when calling for peace, you charged NATO, but did not call out the Russian imperialism.
Well, so I did in a sense that I think the launch of the war is squarely in Putin's lap, so to speak. But I do think that you also need, it doesn't justify, history does not justify the aggression, but it informs it in the context of NATO expansion playing a role. And also, I don't like to do tit for tat, but we were not as pure as many thought in calling out the war of aggression because of Iraq, where Steve and I were the day the war was launched in 2003. And it's sad to see the kind of spheres of influence arguments develop. But no, absolutely. I think that's a given to condemn. But in condemnation, we lose what now? And I think Grigory's humanism is an abiding, powerful view.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Richard or Dr. Yavlinsky, if you wanted to add anything to these remarks in regards to this question.
The only thing that I would like to say is that when we had the Cold War, there was a discussion between two countries. And now the most important issue is that there are not two poles, but at least three. There is also China to reckon with. And there is a whole other number of countries, France and India, Pakistan, Great Britain, and they say Israel as well, part of the game, which means that nowadays the problem is that no one wants to think, how do you reconcile, how do you reach agreement with so many participants? That is why the Cold War, that's what occurred when there were two countries and they engaged in a dialogue and they were capable of reaching a goal. And I agree with Richard. Well, we shouldn't glamorize, we shouldn't romanticize the efforts, but at least there was no war, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But nowadays, the situation is so much more complicated, and there are no signs of anyone thinking or suggesting what can be done. The scientists, the specialists do think about it all the time, but not the politicians.
Thank you. Richard, any final remarks from you?
I would just echo what Grigory just
Хочу поддержать то, что сказал Григорий только что.
Just said very eloquently.
Очень красноречиво он высказался.
At the very moment when the world
В тот самый
desperately
момент, когда
of leadership
когда человечеству так нужно конструктивное руководство.
Elena, I think we can hear your translation. I think you need to change your channel.
Who
Go on, Richard. Go ahead.
Well, I think the complexity and the uncertainty has accentuated a serious decline in the quality of political leadership in the important countries in the world. And that has caused, I think, a very regressive set of tendencies that relies on military responses that don't really address the nature of the challenge, which are partly political, partly ecological, partly technocratic. And somehow or other, even in liberal democracies, there is not being generated the kind of leadership that has the capacity for constructive vision. And without that constructive vision, we're on a fast road to catastrophe.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And with that, let me just thank all of our panelists for their brilliant and thoughtful and important remarks.